Right now, as we speak, you have both farmers as well as people broadly in the agricultural industry sounding rather serious alarm bells over a possible global food crisis descending upon the entire world. In fact, just recently, the World Food Program put together a map which outlined the countries that are either already starving or on the brink of disaster. And when you look at the map, well, to no one's surprise, most of these countries are either in Africa or in the Middle East. These places already had precarious food situations to start with, which have only been exacerbated by both the war in Ukraine as well as the quote-unquote green policies being implemented here in the West. And so while here at home in America, we're looking at possible skyrocketing food prices as well as store shelves being more empty than normal in the coming months, those places face actual calamity. That part wasn't surprising. However, what is surprising is that amidst this reality, many governments are pushing policies which are quite literally handcuffing farmers. For instance, over in the Netherlands, Dutch farmers are being slowly forced off their land due to nitrogen restrictions being imposed by their parliament. The governments of both Canada as well as Ireland are looking to do the same thing to their farmers. Meanwhile, the government of South Africa has been seriously considering expropriating the lands of white farmers, who happen to be the most productive farmers in that country. Then you have the case of Sri Lanka, whose government, just last year, banned the use of chemical fertilizers, which nearly destroyed their entire rice crop and crippled the livelihoods of most people in the countryside. Then, over in the country of New Zealand, you had the government there, unironically, move to place a tax on the pee and the burps that come out of cows. And of course, right here in the US, amidst record levels of drought, our own government is currently tying up farmers in legal quagmires over supposed environmental issues. And so here's the big question to consider. Farming is cyclical. It takes a full season to realize the fruits of labor that you do today. However, the opposite is also true. Seeds that are not planted today will not become vegetables tomorrow. And so the big question is this: while these global politicians are busy saving the planet, who's going to be feeding the people? And in order to help answer that question, I took the opportunity to speak with Mr. Michael Langmeyer. He's a professor over at Purdue University specializing in agriculture economics. So strap yourselves in, smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, and take a listen. So the first question I had was regarding fertilizer, because I know that once the Ukraine-Russia war kicked off, the price of fertilizer globally really skyrocketed. But I was wondering why, because I would imagine that we here in America have our own capacity to make chemical fertilizers, but is it such a global commodity that the price just fluctuates based on what is happening in the world?
Well, certainly the global events are important, particularly for some types of fertilizer, potash in particular. Belarus and Russia are large producers of potash, which is a very important fertilizer ingredient. But nitrogen and phosphorus, a lot of that does come from the United States, but nitrogen is the largest one when it comes to corn production. And the reason why nitrogen costs are really high right now is nitrogen really follows two different inputs. One is natural gas prices, and so when natural gas prices are high, usually anhydrous ammonia, the main nitrogen fertilizer component, is high, but also corn prices. And so it's when you have strong demand for corn, that also creates stronger demand for the nitrogen fertilizer.
So would a given farm use both nitrogen synthetic fertilizer as well as potash, or is one a component of the other? Can you sort of explain that?
Most farms in the Corn Belt would use nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash, but nitrogen is the largest cost when it comes to corn. When it comes to soybeans, they don't need nitrogen. It's a nitrogen fixing plant, and so it's phosphorus and potash. And so it depends on the commodity that you're talking about, which fertilizer is the most important.
And in terms of potash and phosphorus, do we not have our own domestic production that can sort of offset what's happening in Asia and Europe?
It's difficult, and this is a world market when you talk about phosphorus and potash, and so when you see a shortage someplace, it affects prices all over. Even if you have even if you have at least some domestic supply, and so it's a classic case. When you see shortages, you're going to see an increase in price.
So that's really fascinating, because I didn't know there was three different categories. So you're saying potash and phosphorus are sort of driven by this war, whereas chemical nitrogen fertilizer almost has nothing to do with the war. It has more to do with the energy input costs and the price of corn.
Yes, not near as much. I mean, it's not that it's not impacted by world demand, but not near as much as phosphorus and potash, particularly potash is impacted by the Ukraine-Russian war.
And so is the reason that the farmers were this year were able to kind of maintain a decent profit margin is just because they were able to sell their produce at a higher market value?
Well, the Ukraine-Russia conflict was very important to production of corn and wheat in particular, because Ukraine's a large producer of corn, and both Ukraine and Russia are large producers of wheat. And so really those markets were impacted to a large degree, because of the Ukraine-Russia war. And they've been able to get some of the grain out of Ukraine, but it's nothing compared to what they typically can get out of the ports in Ukraine. And so that's impacted the world supplies. And so we're in a situation right now where world supplies for corn, soybeans, and wheat, corn and soybeans in particular, are relatively tight. That's also true in the United States. And so that's why you're seeing some relatively high corn and soybean prices right now, is it's both tight stocks to use in both the U.S., but also in the world. And so it's a classic situation where when stocks get relatively tight, in order for people to continue to sell those inventories, you have to raise the price, and that's essentially what's happening in the United States right now. But that seems to correct itself over time. I mean, we only in the United States we only produce one crop of corn, soybeans, and wheat per year, and we have some second crop soybeans, but it's a really small component, and so it takes quite a while for supplies to be replenished, both in the United States and around the world. But it does tend to self-correct. That's why I said that producers are worried that we're going to see a continued increase or high input costs, and corn, soybean, and wheat prices will decline as the supplies increase again in 23 and 24.
So because of the war, Ukraine and Russia were not able to export their wheat and corn, particularly to some of the African countries which import a lot of those products from there. Now, of course, the ports did open, but from my understanding, they were so filled with mines that even the ships that were able to go, it's kind of a limited supply that was able to get out. So was it the case that U.S. suppliers began to sort of fill that gap and sell to these African countries? Was that the case?
That was particularly true for wheat. These African countries are large buyers of wheat, the U.S. anyway, and so it probably increased the demand for U.S. wheat, from those countries, because it was more difficult to get the wheat out of Ukraine and Russia to a lesser degree.
That's interesting. So the U.S. manufacturers, the U.S. farmers who sold that wheat to Africa, was that wheat already earmarked to be exported, or is that wheat that was essentially taken away from the domestic U.S. market and therefore drove the cost of wheat here in the U.S. higher?
In the U.S., there's enough wheat for domestic production and for exports. In fact, year in and year out, 40 to 50% of the wheat is exported, and so there was enough for domestic market plus export. The stocks to use was not near as tight for wheat this year, and so there was a little bit of more wiggle room when it came to wheat compared to corn and soybeans. And obviously, that's very good news from a food insecurity standpoint or food security standpoint, because corn and soybeans are primarily fed to livestock, and then corn's used for ethanol production, for our auto industry. But wheat obviously is used in the baking industry, and so there was enough wheat for the baking industry in the United States. But again, because of all the problems we were seeing, the supply was smaller in the world, and so the price went up.
All right, just to pause here for a super quick moment, I wanted to mention that the sponsor for today's episode is a super cool company called Sekur. And they're a cool company for people that actually care about their privacy. Because listen, if you don't think that these giant tech conglomerates and all these different alphabet agencies within the US government are spying on your messages, well, then frankly, you are not paying enough attention to the news. However, all that can be in the past, because with Sekur, they have awesome proprietary technology that has all your messages and all your emails actually go through Switzerland as they're making their way back and forth between you and your recipient. And so let's say you're here in America and the person you're messaging is over in Canada, Mexico, or anywhere else in the world. Well, it doesn't matter, because all your messages are actually going through Switzerland back and forth from one to another, meaning that they are not subject to the Cloud Act, and they are only subject to Swiss laws, which are some of the safest in the entire world. Their technology is awesome, it's proprietary, and they're a company that actually cares about your freedom. They care about getting the facts out, which is why they sponsor a company like ours, And best of all, they are offering a 25% off deal for our viewers, for the viewers of Facts Matter. So head on over to Sekur.com and use promo code Roman to get 25% off. And the rates are not even that expensive to start with. It's only $5 for the Messenger and $10 for the email and Messenger combo. And they even offer a 7-day free trial. So again, head on over to Sekur.com, use promo code Roman, save some money, and support an awesome sponsor. So over the last, let's say, month and a half, I've been compiling different statistics that have been coming out of the USDA, different trade groups, and like the Rabobank, the Netherlands Rabobank. And it seems like in terms of the yield for this year and the previous year, it seems like there have been some problems. Like I just have a few earmarked here. Year-to-date shipments of carrots in the U.S. are down 45%. Year-to-date shipments of sweet corn in the U.S. is down 20%. Year-to-date shipments of sweet potatoes in the U.S. is down 13%. Same thing with celery with 11%. And it sort of goes on and on down the list. Why is it that the yields for these particular vegetables are so low?
I can't really speak specifically on vegetables because I do follow corn, soybeans, and wheat a lot closer. But when it comes to all crops in the U.S., we had some serious dry conditions in states, and that certainly had a large impact on crop yields in the United States. And you take even corn, for example, we're below trend yield, and that's because we had a relatively hot and dry June. And that's a very important month for corn, and so I would not be surprised that's also the case with some vegetables. Is they're grown in only a few places in the United States, and if you see dry conditions in those places where those crops are grown, you're going to have reduced yields. Yeah,
I was in California for the last few days. I got back yesterday, and I was talking to some of the farmers in the valley where they grow. Where they grow things like corn and rice, and they were telling me that they have drought conditions, but the government also has certain policies that divert a lot of the farming water over to the fish, and so a lot of their fields went unplanted this year. A lot of the fields are just remain dry, and some of the crops just had to wither away. What do you think this will do to the price of goods at the end of this year and next year?
Certainly, that's going to put upward pressure on food prices, and we've seen some pretty large increases in food prices year to year. If you look at July 21 to July 22, using some USDA data, food prices are up close to 11%. And so general inflation up 8.5% and food prices up 11%. And so the things you're talking about is going to create a situation where food price increase is probably going to be larger than the general inflation rate.
What's the general timeline for something like this? If let's say, for just as one example, the carrots down 45% year to date, that's this year. When do we experience sort of the actual effect of that on the supermarket store shelves? Is it like a 30-day? Is it a 90-day period? How does that work?
Usually, for a lot of crops, it's longer than that. Even if they can grow multiple crops in the year, the growing season is not real short. And so usually it's a matter of months. When it comes to the field crops, it's a year. It takes a full year. For the vegetable crops, it doesn't take a full year typically, but it's months. Rather than weeks. And so it's a little different than a manufacturing business. We just gear up the plant and produce more. You can't really do that because of Mother Nature. You need a certain amount of growing days for all of those crops, including vegetables. And so these problems don't get solved overnight by any stretch. The U.S. food industry right now is eggs. Egg prices increased dramatically in the last few months, and that's because we had a pretty nasty disease in the poultry industry. It takes a long time to overcome that. I mean, first of all, you've got to try to eradicate the disease, and then secondly, you have to respond to those higher prices by trying to increase supply. Well, that doesn't happen overnight, and so that's one of the differences between production and agriculture and some businesses is it takes a while to respond to higher prices and to increase supply.
Yeah, that makes sense. So is it the case that sort of the cyclical nature, it's different for every crop, I imagine, like eggs is different than carrots, than celery, than sweet potatoes, than tomatoes, things like that?
Yeah, the timing is different. Like for eggs, for example, you can it's pretty fast to replace a hen, a laying hen, for example. It's months, but it's not years. Whereas you take cattle, for example, it takes a long time to rebuild that herd. And one of the problems we're having right now in U.S. agriculture has been so dry in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas that we've had to sell some of the cows, and so the inventory of beef cows is down. Well, that's going to impact beef prices for at least 2-3 years. It just takes so long to replace those animals and get to a point where you're raising more calves again and increasing the amount of beef in the U.S. And so it's very, very, very much commodity specific.
Wow. And what happened if the ranchers are in all those states were suddenly selling their cows? Did the price of cows plummet?
Well, the price of cows did go down because there is more supply. But what happened is it wasn't so much that they were responding to prices. They were responding to the fact that they rely on summer pasture to feed the cows, and their summer pasture was not very good, and so they just didn't have the resources they needed in order to feed as large a cow herd, and so they sold a portion of their herd. That's the typical response to dry conditions, particularly if the dry conditions last for several months and even years. The Texas Panhandle has been dry for a while, along with Oklahoma and Kansas, and so that's really the only response they really could take. There's not grass and forage resources in that area to feed all those cows because of the dry weather, and so your only choice really is to liquidate those cows, and then hopefully when the weather does become more normal next year, the year after, you'll replenish your herd.
Well, in terms of like having to wait for the weather to get normal, even some, I would imagine inflation to get down. What is your opinion on what will happen in the future? Because from my understanding, a rancher doesn't even begin to make money on a cow, let's say, until year 3, and the profit only begins in year 5 for that animal. But if they're being forced to sell, I imagine at a loss, or definitely, you can't replenish that sort of inventory overnight. Will it be the case that a lot of small and mid-sized farms that can't absorb it will just go out of business, and there'll be massive consolidation? Maybe these big corporate farms will move in. What do you foresee happening?
Well, it depends on a lot of things, but one of the characteristics of production agriculture right now, including those that have beef cows, is we're in a fairly good situation in terms of liquidity. Meaning that there's quite a bit of current assets available to overcome these losses we may have for the next year or two. That's the case throughout production agriculture. Another characteristic of U.S. agriculture right now is the debt to asset ratio. Solvency is relatively low, and so that really increases our ability. It doesn't mean it's not financial stress, but it does increase our ability to hang on when you do see lower returns. And agriculture is very cyclical. You go through times where there's 2, 3, 4 years in a row where the returns are not very good, and then you go into a period of 1 to 3 years or even longer where returns are really good. And so to respond to that cyclical nature, we do tend to hold quite a bit of liquidity and try to keep the debt to asset ratio relatively low.
Maybe for people who have never been on a farm, or maybe again they live in cities, can you explain what do you mean by farmers having a low debt to asset ratio?
That means that their total debt, the amount they have borrowed on their land, machinery, current production, they borrow money to put the crop in the ground. All of that divided by all of their assets. All their assets. There's cash. There's corn inventories, there's cattle inventories, hog inventories, livestock inventories in general, machinery and equipment. It's very capital intensive business. And so the typical farmer has hundreds of thousands of dollars invested in machinery and equipment. And then the big one is farmland. About 80% of the U.S. balance sheet is farmland. And so most farms, particularly if they're full-time farms, own at least a portion of their land. And so they can also rely on that when times are tough. 2014 to 2019 was a relatively low net farm income years. Some people use that collateral they had in farmland to borrow money and in order to pay some bills. And so that's what I mean by low debt to asset ratio. If you don't have a lot of money borrowed, particularly on farmland, it gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of meeting the cash flow needs in a year when net farm income is relatively low.
So far we've discussed American agriculture, but it seems like going off into Africa, Europe, China, India, like you mentioned, they're all facing kind of simultaneous problems. A lot of the drought, a lot of crop failures. How familiar are you with what's going on in those countries, and what do you think will happen in the future kind of globally?
Food insecurity is a problem that does occur. It doesn't occasionally occur, and it usually occurs when crop prices are relatively high. We saw some concerns in 2007, 2008, when we saw a pop in commodity prices. We're seeing some concerns again today as the prices have climbed in the last couple of years, and this is for crops as well as livestock commodities. And so anytime you see a situation where you have rising prices, there certainly is concerns, and so that's what makes it so important that those countries come up with other items to produce that they can use to trade in order to get the wheat that they need, in order to get the corn and soybeans that they need, in order to get the livestock meat that they need to feed their population. It's going to be very difficult for all of those African countries to be self-sufficient in food production because of the climate that they're facing, and so it's so important that they have something else to trade in order to receive the agricultural commodities from South America, United States, China, and Europe. Countries that do have excess, produce more than they need for domestic consumption.
What's your opinion on some of the global regulatory headwinds that farmers are facing? I just recently got back from Sri Lanka, and I'm sure you knew what happened in Sri Lanka in regards to the farmers. The former president there overnight banned the use of chemical fertilizers. He eventually undid that, but the farmers there are suffering to this very day with many problems that resulted from that decision. However, it seems like Ireland, Canada, the Netherlands, they're all sort of playing and forecasting this reduction in nitrogen sort of at a regulatory level. What do you foresee happening either here in the U.S. or globally in regards to that?
This is very concerning. That's an understatement, probably. And sometimes I think those that are imposing the regulations don't understand the consequences of the regulations. And I want to talk about fertilizer specifically, and I'll talk about it from the U.S. standpoint, but this would be true for all major exporting countries that produce corn, for example. We've done a tremendous job with corn production around the world of not requiring any more nitrogen than what we've used probably for 20, 30 years. So we've kind of kept the amount of nitrogen flat in corn production, but we've increased yields 2% per year. Our 2 bushels per year. It's not quite 2%, but it's close. Two plus bushels per year with no increase in nitrogen. And so those kinds of things need to be understood by the regulators, that the only way we'd be able to increase production is to keep the nitrogen at the level we've used for the last 20 years. If you cut that down too much, you're going to have a large negative impact on production. It's going to impact domestic uses of corn. It's going to impact our ability to export corn to other countries that need that corn. And so we really need to think long and hard about some of these regulations related to fertilizer in particular. Some of the things that are happening in the European Union it's very concerning if those start happening in the United States, Brazil, and Argentina, because that's really going to have a negative impact on food security around the world, because those countries are going to be less able to produce the amount that's needed to satisfy the domestic industry, but also to export. I mean, the U.S. is by far and away the largest corn producer and the largest exporter of corn. If for some reason we couldn't use the amount of fertilizer we need, that might change, and it's particularly problematic if we had some regulations and Brazil did not. Because then your major competitor is at a huge advantage compared to you. And so all of these things need to be considered when you're thinking about regulations related to input use. Wow.
So the government of Canada recently announced a push to reduce nitrogen by about 30%. If I'm not mistaken, by the year 2025. that's their plan. What do you suspect will
That
happen?
would be extremely difficult to do for something like corn production. Would have an extremely negative impact on yields. You talk 5%, something like that, you're not going to have a large impact. You start talking something over 10% reduction, you're talking a major reduction in yields. And again, hurting your capacity to produce the crop domestically. We use a lot of corn in the ethanol industry. We have a very large feed industry, poultry, swine, and beef, both for domestic consumption and for trade purposes. You would severely put a cap on the amount of corn you can produce with anything higher than 10% reduction in nitrogen. So those things are, like I said, very concerning and something that would really be worrisome to farmers. They just have very little ability to reduce the nitrogen that much. And like I said, the story needs to get out that we've done a good job of not increasing it, and at the still time increasing production. I mean, how many industries can say that? Well, we got an increase from production without increasing inputs. That's a huge success story. And I don't always think the regulators fully understand the industry they're trying to regulate.
Wow. I imagine the farmers I've met are very entrepreneurial. They're very thrifty. So I can't imagine they're wasting their fertilizer. So, right. So if they need to, let's say, make a cut, it's not that they're going to stop wasting it. They're going to essentially have to stop, let's say, planting a certain field, right? They would have to just cut back on the acreage.
Yeah, that's what if the increase was 10% or more, that's what they probably would do, and they would probably switch crops to some extent. And again, that would have an impact on corn production, for example. Corn, I'm talking about corn quite a bit because that's the crop that's most sensitive to changes in nitrogen. But also wheat. I mean, wheat it takes quite a bit of nitrogen too, not near as much as corn, but wheat production also is very reliant on wheat production. So if they had to take a cut, and that's primarily in the Great Plains where they produce a lot of the wheat, Kansas, North and South Dakota, Oklahoma, and Texas and those regions. But if they had to reduce nitrogen, we'd also see some fairly large reductions in wheat production, and that would have huge impact on U.S. consumers because the baking industry, takes a large percentage of the wheat and uses it in their industry.
Wow. So, Professor, any last thoughts? Maybe if somebody's watching this and they're going to the supermarket store shelves, they see the prices going up every week. Every time they go there, the price inches up a little bit more and more. Any parting words for them?
Well, one of the adages that someone told me a long time ago, and it's very true. The cure for high prices is high prices. And so, if you see high prices in a particular commodity, farmers are very entrepreneurial. They're going to they can't do it overnight, but they're going to try to increase production in that commodity and try to correct that situation. It's like the egg situation. That's temporary. Eventually we're going to be able to rebuild the number of laying hens in the United States, and egg prices will come down again. And so don't think these things are necessarily going to last forever. Agriculture prices go up and down, and again, some commodities they don't come down that much once you've seen that inflation. Agriculture is not like that. Food is not like that. Some of the items that we've seen some of the largest increases in the supermarket, those prices will come down as we replenish supplies.
And any forecast in when that will be? I think earlier you maybe said 2024.
Well, the USDA is actually thinking 2023 that the food inflation is going to be quite a bit lower. I think it's actually going to take a little longer than that. I think we're still going to see food inflation that's not the 10%, but the food inflation that's maybe 5-6% at least, depending on what the general inflation looks like. I think general inflation is probably going to be that high. It's probably going to be till 24 until you see the smaller increases in food prices.
All right. Well, Professor, thank you so much for enlightening us on this issue. Maybe in a few months when things get updated, we can have you back on and sort of give us an update.
Glad to do that. Thank you.
Take care.